Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight at Cornerstone Church of Christ. This is Matthew Allen, and I'm going to be leading our class this evening on the Beatitudes. We'll be studying together out of Matthew chapter 5. We have a little bit different setup tonight, obviously with the COVID issue that's going on here in the congregation. We decided to pre-record our study together tonight rather than having Mark and I do a panel discussion. And so I want to thank John and Ben, who got here very early this morning, long before the sun came up, to help me with this today so we can have our Bible class ready to go for tonight. We're going to be in Matthew 5:3. I want to start tonight by looking at verses 3 through 5. We'll be reading that together, and then we'll be going through and really focusing in on what verse 5 has to say. Jesus says, beginning in verse 3, he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth." Tonight, as we study together, we want to encourage you to have the Bible class material out. It's on the website tonight under Blessed Are the Humble. Please have that in front of you while we study together tonight. I want you to imagine yourself in the audience that day when Jesus is preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and how shocking it must have felt to be the typical listener hearing the words of Jesus as he preached. His opening statements lay the foundational truth that we never should insist on our own rights, but always display authentic humility. And it is a complete reversal of the way the world conducts itself. It's important to understand that the expectation of the people and what they had, what they were looking for in a Messiah, is not what Jesus was presenting. They saw the Messiah as someone who is a conqueror, someone who would be a ruler, someone who would reestablish Jewish authority and prestige and dominance. And many people thought that the Messiah would come in and remove the Romans from Palestine and elevate the Jews back to being above the rest because the Jews were the people of God. They were looking forward to a time when the Messiah would come and deal harshly with their enemies and oppressors and deliver them from their present situation. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the humble," this is shocking. He's telling that those who are going to come to his kingdom are going to be part of a broken, hearted, crushed spirit. They're going to be mourning for their sin. They're going to be humble. And these words have to be so striking that most people could not comprehend it. They could not get their mind around it, because what he's saying completely defies their expectations. I have to imagine that some people must have walked away. They couldn't handle it. But for those who stayed and listened and took to heart what Jesus is saying, their entire perspective would have changed. I think it's completely natural for us to feel like we're justified in doing things our own way. We want to champion the defense of our own rights. We want to serve our own needs. And what Jesus is talking about here in this text completely strips all of that away. Listen, humility, Greco-Roman world, first century, it is not a virtue. It is something looked down upon. The word Jesus uses here in verse 5 was often associated with failure. It was shameful. It's referring to something that had been crushed or debased. It was the opposite of seeking honor and for one's accomplishments. And in your Bible class lesson, I talk a little bit about the Roman ideal with seeking glory, seeking honor, and talking about your own personal accomplishments. And you can read through that in detail in the lesson. But I want to share with you that this practice was also common among the Jews. The great historian Josephus opens his own autobiography with the type of self-congratulation that would make most of us cringe today. Here's what he says about himself. He says, "I was brought up with my own brother, whose name was Matthias, both father and mother, and I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning. And I appeared to have great memory and understanding. And moreover, when I was a child, about 14, I was commended for all the love I had to learning, on which account the high priest and the principal men of the city came frequently to me together in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of law. Now, we would look at that and go, that guy's conceited. That guy, what's wrong with him? We would kind of frown on this a little bit in society today. And I will tell you, if you think it's bad now, if you go back to the first century and you hear the words of Jesus as opposed to something you see there on the screen, it is completely against the world thinking. It's still a problem even today. Our culture pays lip service to humility. Pride and vainglory, though, are still in great demand. And we see it all around us. Hollywood, sports, the media, the press, everywhere. Advertisements tell us what we deserve. They accentuate our self-importance, and it is always rooted in pride. So the question really comes down to this: how are we going to be able to fight back against this? How can we apply what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5? So here's the Beatitude we want to focus on for a few moments tonight. Jesus in his teaching says, "Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth." So what does he mean when he uses this word here in the text? He means to be humble, to be gentle, or to be meek and considerate. One dictionary describes it as not being overly impressed by a sense of one's self-importance. Another person describes it as how we deal with other people. The humble are those who do not throw their weight around. And when we're talking about this meekness, this gentleness, we're not talking about something that means that we are weak. We are someone that is timid or holds back. In fact, meekness often goes along with great strength and ability. But it is always, especially in this text, always inside this tremendous dependence on God. Another way to look at this is the person who has brought himself under the control of God. So with that, now that we have an understanding of what it is, I think to help us even better, it's important to know what meekness is not. It is not just being nice. Again, it is not just weakness. It's the opposite of violence. It's the opposite of vengeance. In fact, it is the greatest display of strength through the resisting of our human nature. And I want to stress to you tonight that it is not a lack of conviction. It is deep, abiding trust that God is always true to his promises and that his principles are right. So, as we think about what it is and what it's not, then I think it's also important for us to give consideration to how this fits in with the previous two Beatitudes, because this is in the midst of a progression. If you go back and you look at the two previous ones, being poor in spirit, back in verse 3, really involves me looking at myself squarely and having an honest self-assessment and really coming away with an understanding of my own sinfulness. I am a weak, frail human being that is subject to sin and failure. And when I realize how apt I can be to sin, it leads me to mourn for that, where I am sorry and feel a deep sense of regret for my transgressions before God. And meekness is something where I turn my focus to God and I empty myself of all my self-reliance and depend on him. And I want you to see, as we look back at the previous two and put this in perspective with those, understanding humility also helps us when we look at the next beatitude, where we'll be next week. If you look at verse 6, when I have a humble disposition, I will hunger and thirst after righteousness. All of these first four Beatitudes have to do with how we relate to God. God's people are those who put their trust in him and believe in his promises. We wait, we trust in how he is going to act, and we understand that he will take care of every wrong that's ever been committed, and we need to trust in that. Now, I want to talk tonight also about meekness in action, because the Bible is full of examples of meekness. We're going to look at just 4 tonight very, very quickly with this. Obviously, we can go back to the Old Testament. One of the greatest examples, and maybe as we look at Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, Moses might be one of the best human, I'll just put it that way, man, created being, that displayed meekness. And I want you to see what is said regarding him in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Moses was a very humble man, more so than anyone on the face of the earth. And if you go back and look at his life, we can go all the way back to the early chapters of Exodus, where you see him displaying his meekness. Exodus chapter 4, God approaches him and says, I want you to lead my people out of Egypt into the promised land. Now, I'll tell you, I think there have been many times through the years we have looked at his response to that and really criticized him heavily for how he responds. He says, well, I'm not a very good speaker. How are they going to know I'm the guy? How are they going to know I'm the one? And in fact, I have an early sermon from the 90s that I preached on this, where I really got hard on Moses, called it excuses that he made. And I look back at that now and I go, what if I had been Moses? What if this had been God coming to me and I might have had the same response? Who am I? I'm not the most gifted speaker. I don't have all these leadership talents. I might have resisted a little bit too. And really, instead of criticizing Moses, maybe it's good for us to think about his humility on display here. And really his launching forward in trust that God was going to provide and equip him with everything that he needed. It's a tremendous display of humility in my mind. Also, I think you see Moses' humility displayed there in Numbers chapter 12. I read verse 3. It's still on the screen. If you go back a couple of verses there as the chapter opens, Moses is under some withering criticism from even in those in his most inner circle. And he refuses to respond to that. God takes care of the problem. He causes leprosy to come upon Miriam and Aaron, who have to pray for God to remove that because of their criticism over him. But Moses didn't deal with it. He let God deal with it. That's meekness. We also see it in Moses' willingness to adapt and delegate some of his responsibilities as he's leading the people and judging over the people. His father-in-law came in, gave him some advice that he applied, and you see that in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 to 24. So Moses is a great example of humility. Also, I think David is someone we should give consideration to. He, as you know, is chosen to be Saul's replacement as king. He is a man after God's own heart. And we know that after he is anointed by Samuel and the actual time of his installment as king, he went through a very difficult period. Saul realizes what's happening. Saul makes David his enemy, tries to kill him on numerous occasions. And David has to flee for his life. He becomes an outlaw and fugitive. He's having to live off the land. He's having to live in caves and run for his life. And as he survives those attempts on his life, there's an opportunity that he has. It's told to us in 1 Samuel 24, where David has an opportunity to kill the king, to take matters in his own hand, deal with it, problem solved, game over for Saul, and now he can come in and be king. And 1 Samuel 24 tells us that David refrained out of respect for the office of the king. And in fact, that text tells us as he had that, he wanted to let Saul know he was there, so he cut off the fringe of Saul's garment. And the text tells us that even later he regrets doing that. This is a man of meekness. This is a man of self-control who holds himself back, trusts that God will deal with the situation, and he does actually a few years later. But David is a great example of this. Obviously, Paul comes to mind as a great example of humility and meekness. Philippians chapter 3, the opening verses there, recount his extreme Jewish education. He had risen to the very highest level of Judaism. He's a Pharisee with regard to the law. He says he's blameless. He talks in depth about his status and his position as a Jew. It would have been one to be envied by the average person. He had attacked that with his whole being and risen to where he could be well regarded and respected among his people, trained by the best people. He has every right to flaunt his status in Judaism. But what does he say as you look at verses 8, 9, and 10 of Philippians chapter 3? Paul says that he counted all of this as loss in order to view the surpassing riches of Christ. He says, in fact, he uses some very descriptive language. He says, I count all that stuff as dung. It's worthless, because everything in comparison to Christ is like that. He sought after Christ. He walks away from his own acts of righteousness and boasts in the saving work of Christ. And you see that in Philippians 3, 9 through 11. But also, I think you see meekness in action with Jesus. This is perhaps the greatest example. We could draw off a number of examples from Jesus' life. I think the most obvious being his trial and crucifixion. When you think about meekness being power under control, at any moment Jesus could have just said that's it and condemn mankind to die. At any moment he could have said, this is just not worth it. It's over. I'm walking away from it. He doesn't do that. He keeps everything under control. He moves forward with hope and trust in the Lord. And as you go on from this, there are all sorts of other examples that we see in the Gospels. One of the most notable to me is in Matthew 12. You may remember the first 14 verses of the chapter. They give us details on Jesus violating one of the man-made laws regarding the Sabbath. And the Pharisees and religious establishment really have trouble with this. Begins kind of a confrontation between him and the religious leaders of the day gathered there in that synagogue, and he heals a man on the Sabbath. A man had a withered hand. And after that happens, Matthew 12:14 says that the Pharisees went out and plotted against them as to how they might kill him. Now, don't read over that verse lightly, because look at what happens in the next verse. Verse 15 is essential. What does Jesus do? He withdraws from there. He leaves the place. Jesus had an opportunity. He could have still kept the confrontation going. He could have still made his point that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. But instead, by walking away, he shows a gentle and non-confrontational attitude. He demonstrates great patience. He serves mankind in the best way possible. And notice this, he serves through encouragement rather than denunciation. I really think that's an important principle for us, because sometimes I think we just want to let everybody else know where they've messed up, where they've fallen short. We feel like we have a right, based on the Scripture, to do that. And yes, I understand there may be times that needs to happen. But I think there's a really heavy-duty point here that we need to pull out of this. Not all the time is a time to denounce everyone else. In fact, most of the time, I would say, Jesus worked from this perspective of encouragement. Jesus worked from the perspective of persuasion, not denunciation. And he understands that greater confrontations are coming. And he also wants everyone to know that when those confrontations come, he's not the one causing them. It's the reaction of the religious establishment, the reaction of the legalists and the Pharisees and the scribes and all those people. They're the ones taking on the battle to Jesus, of which he will respond accordingly. So the principle that I really want us to camp out on and think about. And look, this can apply in so many ways, in the church, with our family, with people at work, whatever it is. Meekness does not look for confrontation. It seeks peace and the building up of others. Meekness is something that takes the long-term view into consideration. So I think that's incumbent upon us as we think about our congregation here at Cornerstone. We take the long-term view in mind. We seek peace. We seek for the building up of others. We teach. We encourage. We get behind and look at things from the positive and expect and hope for the best out of people. That is meekness in action. So before we wrap up for the night, I want us to give some consideration to the reward for the meek. One of the things that we're trying to accomplish this year, and really especially in the first and second quarter, is to help us develop this emotional connection to Jesus. What attracted some people to Jesus? Not everybody. Obviously, we understand that most people did not follow him. But I think it's important that we remember the Jewish context here. What's going on as a people? Well, if you go back 175 years before Jesus, the Jews had been oppressed, they'd been brutalized, and it's really the reason for the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC. They had been treated just with evil. And the Jews rose up and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And after they defeat their enemies, they enjoy a decade or two of relative independence. But then the Romans come. And all of that goes out the window. And any hope that the Jews had for being an independent, autonomous nation goes out the window. And it's important. By the time of Jesus, the Romans have been in Israel almost 100 years. And the way that they controlled the Jews is really important for us to understand. And the Jewish historian Philo describes him in this way. He talking about Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor of the time of Jesus. And is described this way: being cruel by nature, entirely lacking in remorse. Judea of his day was marked by bribes, robbery, oppression, humiliations, men sent to death untried, and incessant, unmitigated cruelty. The moment that Pilate became procurator, he showed up as how he despised the Jews and their religious laws. And the historian goes on to say, were we to count those who fell in wars, rebellion, those murdered by Herod and the procurators during this dreadful century, were not less of 200,000 men, an appalling number for such a relatively small country. Every country, fallen under Rome's iron yoke, groaned under the harsh bondage, but none felt it so bitterly as did the Jews. Other conquered peoples, Romans was tolerant in their beliefs and ideas. But the Jews no more understood the Romans than the Romans understood the Jews, rising in solid revolt over what to the Romans seemed matters of the most trivial importance. And so that's the background. And so when you consider that background, maybe we can understand the intense hunger from the Jewish population to be delivered from the Romans. And maybe we can begin to see the abject disappointment of some when they come in and hear Jesus preaching on how to get into the kingdom and how it has nothing to do with this world and everything with the world to come, because to them only the evil prospered and the people of God were suffering. But for those who really listened and took the words of Jesus to heart and really engaged their mind and saw the spiritual application of this, the promise of overcoming was there. The promise was there. And that's really important. Again, we talk about the long-term view, the view that God was going to handle all this. And it might not be in their lifetime. It might not even be in that century, but God was going to take care of it. And in the meantime, they were simply to move on with trust and confidence that their inheritance would come. That's the reward of the meek. Trusting in God, knowing that the reward will come. So our last point we want to make tonight is this: meekness is not optional, and three things that I want us to give consideration to. First, meekness is something that's commanded. Two passages in your lesson we talk about tonight: Zephaniah 2 and verse 3. And I want you to see the imperatives in this verse. Seek the Lord, seek righteousness, seek humility. And so these are expectations. We've got to work for it. We've got to look for it. We've got to apply it to our life. And also James chapter 1 and verse 21, I want you to see there that the admonition is, rid yourself of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly receive the implanted word which is able to save your souls. So I've got to take myself out of the equation. Meekness is commanded. And going along with that is, you will not be saved without it. Again, two passages, Psalm 149, the Lord takes pleasure in his people. He adorns the humble with salvation. And finally, Matthew chapter 18, whoever humbles himself like a little child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You cannot be saved without it. And finally, you cannot effectively share your faith without humility. And this is a passage that many of us are familiar with. 1 Peter chapter 3, in your hearts regard Christ as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. So pride is something that will damage your influence. So we have to put these practices in our life. So tonight we've looked at Matthew chapter 5 and what it means to be humble. And I hope that this has challenged you. This was certainly a challenging lesson for me in putting together because it reminds me that I still have work to do. And we all still have work to do with this. We want to encourage you to come back and be a part of our class next Wednesday night. We're going to be in verse 6, talking about those who are blessed and how they seek after and thirst after hunger for righteousness. So we'll be talking about that next week. Thanks for joining us tonight. We will see you next week.